Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth just issued a deadly warning that would shake Beijing to its core.
So we know what they believe and what they're about. We also know how strong we are and the military advantages we have. They know that also.
After catching China red-handed supplying cartels with the chemicals killing 200 Americans daily, Hegseth's retaliation was swift and devastating. But what led to this unprecedented confrontation? Let's break it down. The deadly strike that changed everything. The Caribbean waters erupted in flames as American missiles found their target. 11 drug traffickers died instantly, their speedboat disintegrating in a violent explosion that would send shockwaves across the hemisphere and mark a dramatic escalation in America's war on cartels. But this wasn't just another drug bust gone kinetic. This was the moment Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth delivered a deadly warning that would reverberate all the way to Beijing. What unfolded in those waters wasn't just a tactical victory against drug trafficking. It was the opening salvo in a broader confrontation with China, the shadowy enabler funding and supplying the very cartels America had just obliterated. The strike that killed those 11 traffickers was precision incarnate, but the message it sent to Beijing was crystal clear. The era of tolerating Chinese complicity in America's fentanyl crisis was over. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we need to grasp the staggering scale of destruction that Chinese-enabled cartels have wrought on American soil. The ongoing U.S. opioid epidemic, driven largely by illicit fentanyl, has claimed over 450,000 American lives since 2014, with synthetic opioids like fentanyl responsible for more than 70% of overdose deaths in recent years. That translates to roughly 200 deaths per day, a casualty rate that exceeds many active war zones. The boat that exploded in those Caribbean waters wasn't just carrying drugs, it was carrying death itself, manufactured in Chinese laboratories, refined in Mexican cartel facilities, and destined for American streets where it would claim hundreds more lives. According to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, nearly all illicit fentanyl enters the U.S. from Mexico, where cartels produce over 90% of the supply using Chinese precursors. Secretary Hegseth's words carried the weight of absolute certainty. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or collateral damage. American intelligence had tracked this vessel, identified its cargo, and confirmed its allegiance to Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan narco-terrorist organization that had been systematically poisoning American communities with Chinese-supplied fentanyl. But the strike represented something far more significant than eliminating 11 drug traffickers. It marked a fundamental shift in American strategy, from passive interdiction to active elimination, from treating the symptoms to attacking the source. The U.S. strikes on suspected cartel vessels in the southern Caribbean marked a shift from interdiction, boarding seizures, to preemptive destruction. The precision of the operation was breathtaking. American forces, utilizing assets from the USS Iwo Jima and other naval platforms positioned strategically throughout the Caribbean, had achieved what traditional law enforcement could never accomplish. They hadn't just intercepted drugs, they had eliminated the entire trafficking network in a single devastating blow. The assets Hegseth referenced weren't just impressive, they represented the most formidable naval deployment in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. 9 U.S. warships, for example, USS San Antonio, USS Gravely, and 2,200 Marines from an amphibious readiness group patrol the region. This wasn't a routine counter-narcotics operation. This was a military task force designed to project American power and deliver lethal consequences to anyone foolish enough to traffic drugs toward U.S. shores. The transformation in American approach was as dramatic as it was overdue. For decades, the United States had played defense, treating drug trafficking as a law enforcement problem rather than a national security threat. Agents would seize tons of drugs at the border, arrest low-level dealers, and dismantle trafficking networks piece by piece, only to watch new ones spring up like hydras. The traditional approach had failed catastrophically, with 100,000 Americans dying from drug-related deaths annually under the Biden administration. But under President Trump's renewed leadership and Hegseth's direction, America had declared war on the cartels themselves. Trump's February executive order designating cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, unlocked military-grade responses that had previously been reserved for international terrorists. The legal framework that had been used to hunt down Al-Qaeda and ISIS was now being applied to the Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The hemisphere Hegseth referenced had become a battleground where the stakes couldn't be higher. On one side stood American forces, equipped with the most advanced military technology on Earth and backed by the full weight of U.S. intelligence capabilities. On the other side lurked the cartels, funded by Chinese money, supplied with Chinese chemicals, and protected by corrupt governments that had grown fat on drug profits. The precision strike that eliminated those 11 traffickers wasn't just about stopping one boat carrying drugs, it was about establishing a new paradigm where trafficking networks would face immediate immediate, lethal consequences. The message resonated far beyond the Caribbean waters where those flames died down. In cartel strongholds across Mexico and Venezuela, in Chinese chemical laboratories, and in the corridors of power in Beijing, decision-makers suddenly understood that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. The intelligence capabilities that made this strike possible represented years of patient work by American agencies. U.S. forces had tracked the vessel, identified its cargo, and confirmed its destination with absolute precision. This wasn't a lucky intercept. It was the culmination of sophisticated surveillance operations that had penetrated the highest levels of cartel organizations and mapped their entire supply chain from Chinese laboratories to American streets. But perhaps most significantly, the strike demonstrated America's willingness to take unilateral action when faced with threats to homeland security. For too long, diplomatic protocols and international sensitivities had constrained American responses to the fentanyl crisis. While bureaucrats debated jurisdiction and sovereignty, Americans were dying by the hundreds every single day. The comprehensive nature of the American deployment revealed the scope of the threat and the magnitude of the response. Air assets provided surveillance and strike capabilities, naval forces controlled sea lanes, and intelligence networks penetrated cartel communications. This wasn't reactive law enforcement. This was proactive warfare designed to eliminate threats before they could reach American soil. The psychological impact of the strike extended far beyond its immediate tactical effects. Cartel leaders who had operated with impunity for decades suddenly found themselves on the target list of the world's most advanced military. The comfortable distance between their operations and American consequences had been eliminated. The stage was now set for a broader confrontation that would expose the true architects of America's fentanyl crisis. As debris from that destroyed speedboat settled into Caribbean waters, attention turned to the shadowy enablers who had made such trafficking possible in the first place. The trail of Chinese chemicals, Chinese money, and Chinese protection that had sustained the cartels was about to face unprecedented scrutiny and devastating consequences. Exposing the Chinese connection. While the smoke cleared from that precision strike in the Caribbean, Secretary Hegseth was preparing to expose a far more insidious threat, one that reached into the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party and threatened the very foundations of American society. The boat that had been destroyed was merely the final link in a supply chain that originated thousands of miles away in Chinese laboratories, funded by Chinese banks, and protected by Chinese officials who had turned chemical warfare into state policy. The scope of Chinese involvement in America's fentanyl crisis defied comprehension. China remains the primary global source of fentanyl precursor chemicals, accounting for 90 to 95% of global supply, according to DEA assessments. These weren't accidental exports or regulatory oversights. They represented a deliberate policy framework designed to flood American markets with the deadliest drug in human history.
So their leader, Maduro, who we put a $50 million bounty on his head, has called out to China for help in this. And China's condemning the U.S. And saying, I shouldn't use the word condemn.
The connection between Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro and Chinese enablers wasn't coincidental. It represented a systematic alliance designed to undermine American interests through narco-terrorism. China aids cartels indirectly through alliances with Venezuela, Cartel de los Solos, and Maduro, who facilitates cocaine and fentanyl trafficking. When American forces struck that cartel vessel, they weren't just hitting drug traffickers. They were disrupting a Chinese-Venezuelan narco-state that had declared chemical war on the United States. The evidence of Chinese complicity was overwhelming and undeniable. A bipartisan U.S. House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party's April 2024 investigation, drawing on declassified intelligence, financial records, and interviews, concluded that the CCP is not a passive bystander, but an active enabler. The committee's findings revealed a sophisticated infrastructure designed to maximize the flow of deadly chemicals to American streets while minimizing Chinese legal exposure. The Chinese government's subsidization of fentanyl precursor exports represented economic warfare disguised as trade policy. The CCP provides generous incentives for precursor exports, including VAT rebates of up to 17%, low-interest loans from state banks, and reduced electricity costs for chemical plants. These weren't market-driven policies. They were strategic weapons designed to destabilize American society while generating massive profits for Chinese state-linked enterprises. The scale of these subsidies was staggering. A 2024 petition to the U.S. Trade Representative documented documented over $500 million in such subsidies since 2019, effectively undercutting global competitors and flooding the market. Chinese chemical companies could sell fentanyl precursors at artificially low prices because their government was subsidizing exports specifically designed to harm American communities. The sophistication of Chinese money laundering operations revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Chinese money laundering networks, CMLNs, have become indispensable to Mexican cartels, handling billions in drug proceeds annually. These networks weren't independent criminal enterprises. They represented state-tolerated activities that enabled cartel operations while circumventing Chinese capital controls. From 2020 to 2024, FinCEN analyzed 137,153 suspicious activity reports, totaling $312 billion linked to CMLNs, primarily for Sinaloa and CJN. The numbers were so massive they defied traditional law enforcement capabilities. Chinese networks had essentially become the central bank for Mexican cartels, providing financial infrastructure that enabled industrial-scale drug trafficking. The Chinese government's protection of trafficking networks revealed the true nature of their involvement. Despite scheduling all fentanyl analogs as controlled substances in 2019, enforcement is selective. Chinese authorities rarely prosecute major exporters, even after U.S. indictments. When American agencies identified Chinese companies shipping precursors to cartels, Chinese officials would tip off the companies rather than cooperate with law enforcement. The case of Hubei Aox Biotech perfectly illustrated this pattern of protection. In February 2025, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement charged Hubei Aox Biotech and its executives with shipping precursors to Mexican labs, but Chinese police ignored extradition requests. The company continued operating with Chinese government protection, even after being exposed as a major supplier to cartel fentanyl operations.
They're warning us we should look out for the different countries' integrity. Are you worried about China and their relationship with Venezuela, and how will that affect our policy?
No, the only person that should be worried is Nicolas Maduro, who's running effectively as a kingpin of a narco state, not actually elected, and indicted for $50 million by the United States.
Hegseth's dismissal of Chinese concerns revealed the fundamental shift in American policy. The United States was no longer going to tolerate diplomatic protests from countries actively enabling attacks on American citizens. China's official stance emphasizes cooperation. In 2019, President Xi pledged to classify all fentanyl variants as controlled substances, and bilateral working groups have led to some precursor scheduling, but these gestures were transparently inadequate compared to the scale of continuing Chinese complicity. The technological sophistication of Chinese trafficking networks demonstrated state-level capabilities. Chinese firms advertised precursors on e-commerce platforms like Alibaba, using euphemisms, for example, research chemicals, and offering customs clearance services for Mexico. These weren't amateur operations. They represented industrial-scale chemical warfare conducted through commercial channels with government protection. The economic incentives driving Chinese participation were enormous. Each 1% rebate increase correlates to a 13% export volume spike, per economic studies cited in U.S. trade representative petitions. Chinese companies could generate massive profits by manufacturing chemicals that would kill Americans, with their government subsidizing exports and protecting them from prosecution.
And we know he's involved in the types of drug running that has affected the American people directly. So China and other countries are going to say certain things, and that's their prerogative. What we have there in the Caribbean is a clear demonstration of military might.
The military deployment Hegseth referenced represented more than just tactical capabilities. It demonstrated American willingness to use overwhelming force against Chinese-enabled threats. The message to Beijing was unmistakable. America would no longer tolerate Chinese chemical warfare disguised as trade policy. The strategic implications of Chinese involvement extended far beyond immediate drug trafficking. A 2025 West Point analysis framed it as asymmetric conflict, noting how U.S. overdose deaths, over 1 million since 2010, mirror wartime casualties. The Chinese government was essentially conducting chemical warfare against American civilians while maintaining plausible deniability through commercial channels. The financial scope of Chinese money laundering revealed the true scale of their complicity. A single operation, Fortune Runner, laundered $50 million from 2019 to 2023. Chinese networks had captured 70 to 80% of cartel money laundering, up from negligible multiple levels in 2014, representing a systematic infiltration of Mexican criminal enterprises. The bureaucratic sophistication of Chinese subsidies demonstrated government-level coordination. Precursors like N-phenyl-4-piperidone, NPP, 4-anilino N-phenethylpiperidine, ANPP, and over 20 related chemicals qualify for the maximum 13% VAT rebate. These weren't accidental policy outcomes. They represented deliberate decisions to incentivize exports of chemicals with no legitimate use except drug manufacturing.
President Trump has shown, whether it's the southwest border, whether it's the Houthis in freedom of navigation, whether it's Midnight Hammer in Iran, that the precise application of American power can have incredible impacts and reshape dynamics around the world and in the region. So Nicolas Maduro, as he considers whether or not he wants to continue to be a narco trafficker, has some decisions to make, and that's all I'll say.
The precision applications of American power that Hegseth referenced weren't just tactical victories. They represented a fundamental shift toward confronting state sponsors of terrorism and chemical warfare. The Chinese government's enabling of fentanyl trafficking would face the same devastating consequences that had eliminated other threats to American security. As evidence of Chinese complicity mounted, the stage was set for an unprecedented confrontation between the world's two superpowers. The chemicals that killed those 11 traffickers in the Caribbean had originated in Chinese laboratories, funded by Chinese banks, and protected by Chinese officials. The time for diplomatic niceties and trade negotiations had passed. America was preparing to deliver consequences that would reshape the global balance of power. Hegseth's deadly warning and America's new war. The moment had arrived for Secretary Hegseth to deliver the message that would reverberate through the halls of power in Beijing and send shockwaves through the global geopolitical order. Standing before the cameras with the full weight of American military might behind him, Hegseth was about to issue a warning that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the world's two superpowers and signaled the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one where chemical attacks on American citizens would face devastating military retaliation.
Well, unfortunately, the weakness of the previous administration has driven Russia and China closer together. That was a terrible development of a lack of American leadership and a lack of American strength.
Hegseth's words carried the weight of hard-earned experience and strategic clarity. The Chinese-Russian alliance that had emerged during the Biden years wasn't just a diplomatic inconvenience. It represented an existential threat to American interests that required immediate and decisive action. Beijing's celebration of its alliance with Russia and North Korea through military parades featuring advanced equipment demonstrated the emergence of an axis specifically designed to challenge American global leadership. But China's most devastating attack on America wasn't coming through traditional military channels. It was flowing through the fentanyl supply chain that had already killed more Americans than the Vietnam War, Korean War, and Iraq War combined. The precision strike in the Caribbean had eliminated the final link in this chain of destruction, and now Hegseth was preparing to target the source.
Welcome to the War Department, ladies and gentlemen. You, right now, here in Puerto Rico and around the Caribbean, are on the front lines for the American people.
It's pretty impressive, huh, Rachel?
It's very, very impressive.
I mean, it is American power projection.
The transformation of the Defense Department into the War Department wasn't just symbolic. It represented a fundamental shift in American strategic thinking. The War Department was founded by George Washington in 1789. The long history of the War Department of this country. We won World War I and World War II with the War Department. America was returning to its warrior roots, abandoning the defensive mindset that had allowed adversaries like China to wage unrestricted warfare against American citizens. The military assets that Hegseth had deployed represented unprecedented American power projection in the Western Hemisphere. No other country in the world has this, or can maintain this, or can do this in real time. Just lined up on here is more firepower than most countries have, especially in certain parts of the world. This wasn't just about stopping drug boats. This was about establishing American dominance in a hemisphere that Chinese influence had been systematically penetrating for decades. The strategic implications of Chinese involvement in cartel operations extended far beyond drug trafficking. China is making a play in our hemisphere as well. Previous administration was asleep at the wheel in multiple aspects of Central and South America. Chinese investments in ports, infrastructure, and governments throughout Latin America had created the logistical framework that enabled cartel operations while advancing Chinese strategic interests.
Well, protect the homeland, protect the American people. Core national interests, the safety of the American people. Stop the killing, stop the poisoning of the American people. It's as simple as that. I mean, how long have drug cartels waged war on our communities? on our families, on our young people, on our streets. Violent cartels that made their way easily across the southern border under Joe Biden and his disastrous policy.
The scope of the war that cartels had waged against America was staggering in its brutality and effectiveness. Over 100,000 Americans died from drug-related deaths annually under the Biden administration, representing a casualty rate that exceeded most military conflicts. Chinese-supplied fentanyl had become the most effective weapon ever deployed against American civilians, killing more Americans than enemy action in every war since World War II combined. The precision with which American forces had eliminated those cartel operatives demonstrated capabilities that terrified adversaries across the globe. I watched the strike live. We knew exactly who it was, exactly what they were doing, exactly where they were going, what they were involved in. This level of intelligence penetration and operational precision sent an unmistakable message to Chinese enablers. American surveillance capabilities had compromised their entire network.
So if he gets turned in by one of his inner circle, or if he decides to negotiate his exit out of Venezuela, then what happens?
Well, the president has a lot of decisions. I wouldn't want to be Nicolas Maduro right now. And Maduro's got a lot of decisions to make.
The $50 million bounty on Maduro represented more than just law enforcement. It demonstrated American willingness to target heads of state who enabled attacks on American citizens. The message to Chinese leaders was clear. No one was beyond the reach of American consequences, regardless of diplomatic status or geographic distance. The economic warfare that America had unleashed against Chinese enablers was already producing dramatic results. In February 2025, President Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Chinese chemicals under Section 301, targeting the opioid supply chain. These weren't traditional trade measures. They represented economic weapons designed to destroy the financial incentives that had made Chinese participation in fentanyl trafficking profitable. The legislative response in Congress demonstrated bipartisan recognition of the Chinese threat. House Resolution 830 condemned the CCP, while December 2024 bipartisan bills from the Fentanyl Policy Working Group enhanced sanctions on Chinese firms and improved DEA-CBP coordination. American lawmakers had finally understood that diplomatic engagement with chemical warfare sponsors was not just futile, it was counterproductive.
This is a very big operation. What is your message to the entire hemisphere?
The message to the hemisphere, as it has been from President Trump at the beginning, is that we're going to achieve peace through strength. We're going to put America first. In this case, the Americas first, our hemisphere, secure our homeland.
The doctrine of peace through strength that Hegseth articulated represented a fundamental departure from decades of failed diplomatic engagement. America would no longer tolerate Chinese chemical warfare, Russian aggression, or cartel terrorism. The hemisphere that had been systematically infiltrated by hostile powers would be reclaimed through the application of overwhelming American military superiority. The intelligence capabilities that had enabled the Caribbean strikes represented a revolution in American counterintelligence operations. FinCEN's 2023 report flagged $1 billion in suspicious fentanyl-related transactions, leading to indictments. American financial intelligence had penetrated the Chinese money laundering networks that sustained cartel operations, providing targeting data for both economic sanctions and kinetic strikes. The transformation of American military doctrine under Hegseth's leadership extended far beyond counter-narcotics operations.
You ensure that the American people in the homeland are safe, and demonstrations of parades are fine, but they don't hopefully manifest in actually military conflict. So we know what they believe and what they're about. We also know how strong we are and the military advantages we have.
The military advantages that Hegseth referenced weren't just technological. They represented strategic thinking that had been absent during the previous administration's appeasement policies. The Defense Department's September 5th strategy prioritizes homeland over China threat, per Politico, marking a fundamental shift toward defending American interests rather than projecting power in distant theaters. The Chinese response to American escalation revealed the effectiveness of Hegseth's strategy. On September 3rd, China's foreign ministry decried the strike as violating Venezuela's sovereignty and the UN Charter, following Maduro's meeting with Ambassador Lan Hu, who criticized U.S. coercive measures. The panic in Chinese diplomatic circles demonstrated that decades of consequence-free chemical warfare against America had suddenly become prohibitively expensive.
But we're not going to sit back and watch the American people be threatened. We're not going to sit back and watch the American people be poisoned, watch people be trafficked, watch violent gangs exist inside our country. That's why you're seeing mass deportation.
The comprehensive nature of American response extended beyond military strikes to include immigration enforcement, financial sanctions, and diplomatic isolation. Mass deportations were eliminating cartel networks that had operated with impunity on American soil, while Treasury sanctioned Guangzhou Tengyue Chemical in September 2025 for precursor trafficking. The international support for American actions demonstrated the effectiveness of Hegseth's approach. The region has welcomed it, very much so, a lot publicly, many privately, saying thank you. Thank you for addressing something that's been obvious for us for far too long. Nations throughout Latin America had suffered under Chinese-enabled cartel violence and welcomed American intervention that their own governments had been too weak or corrupted to provide.
Any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent.
Hegseth's warning about Chinese military aggression extended beyond the fentanyl crisis to encompass the full spectrum of Chinese threats to American interests. The era of consequence-free Chinese warfare against American civilians had ended. Through precision military strikes, economic sanctions, and diplomatic isolation, America had demonstrated that attacks on its people would face devastating retaliation. Regardless of the sophistication of Chinese denial and deception operations, the message to Beijing was unmistakable. Pete Hegseth had issued his deadly warning, and America was prepared to back it up with the full weight of its military, economic, and intelligence capabilities. The Chinese Communist Party's chemical warfare campaign against American citizens would face the same fate as those 11 traffickers in the Caribbean: swift, precise, and utterly devastating annihilation. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.